All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Epictetus's Greatest Hits. And what we're going to do in this Zoom call is we're going to talk about what Scott and I together thought these are the greatest hits from Epictetus's Enchiridion. And we agreed on most of these independently of one another, which I thought was quite interesting. And so importantly, Scott is doing a translation of this now and doing a commentary of it. And this is going to come out in Bloomsbury Press. And so let's get started. We're going to go through each of the chapters that we listed. And let me just tell you a little about myself. And then Scott will give an introduction to himself. And I'm David Kaspar. I teach philosophy. And what I've been doing in recent years is I've developed a kind of personal development program called High Performance Stoicism. And one thing I'm very excited about is how applicable Stoicism is to our lives, to improving it. And just one thing to note about me and our good old friend from ancient Rome, Epictetus. This book was the main Stoic book I read regularly for many years. I taught it to my class at least once or twice a year, and it was a student favorite. And I think when you read it, you can see why. Okay, so Scott, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'll do my best to be brief about it. I'm Scott Aikin. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. It is totally gorgeous outside right now. I did a lot of gardening this morning, and now I get to do some philosophy. Read a handful of books. I just grabbed a couple off the shelf. Epistemology and the Regress Problem. Whys go longer than you think they do. You just always ask why. Keep going. That's the regress problem. Political Argument in a Polarized Age with Robert Talisse. That just recently came out. That's about how to argue with people that you hate. And straw man arguments. That just came out. That came out a week ago with John Casey from Bloomsbury. And that's just a study in argumentation theory. How does the straw man work? Here's the puzzle of the straw man. If someone says your view back to you and it's dumb, how in the world is that supposed to convince you of anything? How does straw manning work? if you might say, I know what I just said. How do you saying it dumb back to me make me think I was wrong? So that's a puzzling fallacy. How the hell does that work? So we wrote a book. I was like, I don't know how the fuck that works. Why is that a fallacy? Fallacies are supposed to be things that are effective, not things that are ineffective. How does that work? And so it turns out that they're all over the place. So how in the world does it work? Well, we had to write a book to, at the very least, get to the bottom, at the very least, exactly what the problem is. I'm currently working on a translation of Epictetus's Enchiridion. David had already mentioned this, with William Stevens at Creighton University. We think that a lot of the translations are a little stilted. The thing about Epictetus is that he wrote it in Koine Greek. It was supposed to be super accessible to everybody. The problem is that classicists translate it, and classicists don't know how people talk for some reason. they're deep into language, but nevertheless seem to not be able to communicate with their neighbors. So our objective was to make a translation that was both accessible, and then a set of commentaries in there to also help direct sort of what the arguments are in the Enchiridion, help contextualize the Stoic tradition. And then the last chapter, especially given the way that I like to do philosophy, I think that you always need to be able to anticipate and answer objections. And so the last chapter of our commentary is a set of objections and replies. And some of the objections are better than I think many people who are practicing Stoics give them credit for. And so I think that contemporary Stoics, especially given the fact that Stoicism is a cognitivist program, it's about developing your critical thinking, need to be able to take seriously the objections against the view and to be able to answer them. So that's the next book. It's due to the press at the end of May. Hopefully we'll make that date. And it should be out by 2023. All right, thanks for coming. I don't know if it's as gorgeous there where you are as it is in Nashville, but thanks for making time on a Saturday afternoon to talk about deep things.
No, and I definitely second Scott's appreciation for all of you for coming. This is going to make it much more interesting. And so, Scott, why don't you start with chapter 1 of our greatest hits and give your take on it for a couple minutes, and then we'll get into a discussion.
Okay. So chapter 1 is the place where I think that's the one that everyone reads the closest, everyone's the most familiar with, and it's on the greatest hits for a reason. But it's the fundamental division between what's up to us and what isn't. One of the things to note about this is that we were talking earlier about the connection between Stoic physics and Stoic ethics, that you need Stoic physics to do Stoic ethics. And it turns out that the grand division is not an ethical division. It's a division in what the Stoics called physics. It's a point about human beings and their nature. And so it's about what you might say our will is effective in controlling. So the things that are up to us, according to Epictetus, are our desires, our understanding, our aversions. Those things are up to us. And then our bodies, our state, our wealth, our status, those are things that are not up to us. And the criterion for, you might say, sorting what's up to us and what's not is whether or not our will directly affects it. If you will it one way or it doesn't directly affect it. And on the one hand, from one perspective, this seems like it's a kind of pretty intuitive distinction. It feels pretty familiar. But maybe let's start problematizing it right off the bat. Because one of the challenges is to see that perhaps you've maybe had this problem. Have you ever been in love with somebody that you shouldn't have and you knew that you shouldn't have? Have you ever desired something that you knew you shouldn't desire, and nevertheless your knowledge that you shouldn't desire it didn't make that desire go away? Chocolate cake, right? Your neighbor's wife or whatever that, right? You know that you shouldn't have that thing. And so here's the problem. The very initial problem, I think, of Epictetus's Enchiridion is the fact that he says that our desires and our aversions are things that are up to us, and that the criterion is us willing one way or the other is how we sort those things that are up to us. The problem immediately should be for us that our beliefs are not directly up to us. If I offered you $1,000, you could not believe that Donald Trump is currently the president. Well, maybe, but you couldn't believe that Abraham Lincoln, let's put it that way, we know he's dead. If I offered you $1,000, you couldn't believe that Abraham Lincoln, maybe you could say that Abraham Lincoln is currently president, but you couldn't really believe it. You couldn't do it just on the basis of you just saying, I want to believe something. Turns out that your beliefs aren't directly under your will. Turns out that your desires are not directly under your will. It turns out that your aversions are not directly under your will. And so maybe the first place to start is with, what exactly does Epictetus mean when he says your willing will affect it? It is under your control. And I think that the best strategy is to say it's under our indirect control. With certain kinds of strategies and methods, we can kind of plot against ourselves. Anyone who is familiar, is anyone here familiar with Pascal's wager? This is maybe one of the best ones about beliefs not being under our control. Here's a very simple version of Pascal's wager. God exists or he doesn't. Yeah? Yes. You either believe he does or he doesn't, right? And let's just assume that God is the kind of God that punishes you for not believing in him and rewards you with heaven for him doing so. And so the problem is that not believing him means that if he doesn't exist, you get nothing, right? But if he does exist, you get hell. If he does exist, you either get heaven, right, or you get hell. So you get a problem, right? And so it looks like the best bet is to just believe in God, right? You either get heaven or nothing, versus not believe, you get nothing or hell, right? That's a bad bet. So the problem that Pascal immediately runs into is that he can't make himself, on the basis of seeing that it's a good bet, believe that God exists, right? You can't be like, hey, right? See, it's a good bet. You can't do that. You can't control your beliefs. But what you can do is you can control where your attention goes. You can control what you think about. you can control what kinds of evidence that you repeat to yourself and you present to yourself. And so what Pascal does is he says, I'm going to stop talking to atheists. I'm going to stop thinking about the problem of evil and about if God's so great, why is the world so sucky? I'm going to stop thinking about that problem. And I'm going to start thinking about how awesome God is. I'm going to start reading the Bible. I'm going to start thinking about the beautiful things in the world. I'm going to start talking to really famous people. Yes.
Okay. I just
Have I gone over?
What?
No, I mean,
yeah, but
the whole point is that you can go sideways on yourself. What you can do is you can have these ways of indirectly controlling your beliefs by controlling what you think about. What Epictetus's Stoicism is committed to is a set of exercises for you to be able to have an indirect control over your beliefs and your desires and your aversions. Stoicism, on the one hand, is a set of commitments, but on the other hand, it's a set of skills to be able to keep those commitments in place.
Okay.
And so that's the key.
Okay, Scott. So this what you brought up raises an important question, and the heat with which it is discussed, especially in online places, is pretty stunning. But this is going to connect with your translating, because so part of the controversy is what is exactly the best translation. And I do think, to some extent, control or not control, even if it is practically helpful, is somewhat misleading. And because you start to find out by reading the list, wait, I can control my body, but I can't control who I love or who I care about or my basic beliefs about the world right now, which Epictetus himself gets into, that you can't believe it's night when it's day. So the question is, and I do like your what the will can directly affect, because I recently thought that what reason can directly do is a good way of saying what is up to us. But so my question is, when we talk about what you can directly do, today, I cannot directly control what my desire is, but I can have thoughts and undertake exercises or actions that at some point it will be in my control. So my main question for you is, and you're going to spoil the surprise, how are you translating sentence number 1?
So here's the translation that Bill and I have got. There's some things that are up to us and things that are not up to us. The things that are up to us are understanding, impulse, desire, aversion, and in a word, whatever acts are ours. Whatever acts are ours. The things not up to us are body, possessions, reputation, power, and in a word, whatever acts are not ours. So again, the puzzle here is, well, look, I mean, in some ways, the puzzle is there's a difference between willing something and your will being able to control those things, and then whether or not the acts are yours. So take, for example, you might say your foot. There's a difference between tripping somebody intentionally and tripping somebody unintentionally, right? You can stick your foot out, right? Or your foot can just be sticking out and sticking out while without you paying attention to what you're doing, right? So you can unintentionally trip somebody walking by. And so some acts are ours, right? Mm-hmm. That you have the intention and then it brings that thing about. Some acts are not ours, that they just happen without our intention. The issue here is, you might say, what exactly makes for an act for us to have ownership of an act? Right. And it's got to be that our will, our volition, that we had some goal that we had in mind, that we endorsed and said, boom, let's do that. The issue is that how we nevertheless sort, right? I mean, for example, like, you know, whether or not our body is not up to, like, what our bodies are not up to us, but our beliefs are. And that seems, again, a little bit on the strange side. But one answer is that it does look like, by the way, we can take indirect control over our bodies too, right? It looks like we can say like, well, it's not up to me whether or not I've got, like, I can't will otherwise that I have, you know, that I'm overweight or something like that, or that I'm bald. Oh no. But I can do things about the overweight thing. I can eat right, I can exercise or something like that, or I can do something about my metabolism. Maybe I could have some kind of indirect control over that. And the thought is that maybe instead of this being a sort of a strict dividing line, so this is again the revisionary program. Instead of this being a strict dividing line, this is more a kind of a continuum, that we've got kinds of things that are directly under our control, which is just our will, which is, of course, our will's under our will's control. That's just the will. But then there are things that are sort of more responsive to your will and more responsive to those indirect strategies than things that are less responsive to those indirect strategies. So the fundamental divide isn't, you might say, a strict, so again, this is revisionary. This is not classic Stoicism. This is the revisionary program. But the revisionary program says, look, think about this instead of it being a strict divide. Think of it as a kind of a continuum. And what you really need to be doing is paying attention to things on the side of the continuum of the things that are more directly up to you. You still have to take these other indirect routes, but these indirect routes, as it turns out, once you master them, are really effective.
Right.
Indirect routes with the other things that are up to you, there are just too many slips between the cup and the lip for you to think that you're responsible for them.
Okay, so here is my thinking on what is responsible for this dichotomy, because in Epictetus's mind, it's either whatever inventory you can, you know, in terms of your experience, your life, what you encounter, it's on either one side or the other.
I'm on a Zoom call right now. I can't talk. Okay.
Could you, hi Bruno, could you mute your?
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Okay. So I think what is responsible for the dichotomy is not experience, but rather the fact that a soul is totally distinct from a body, even though they had this interpenetrating relationship, according to the Stoics. So that we can, and I did anticipate chapter 1 would be would generate quite a lengthy discussion, and I know we could have gone on, but let's go to chapter 2, which interestingly, and in my view, this is one of the more disappointing chapters. It's one of the chapters that I do agree that it's one of the greatest hits, but here's the thing about chapter 2. In chapter 1, Epictetus gives all these sky-high promises. You will be free. You will never suffer harm. You will never do anything against your will. And then the way I understand chapter 2 is that Epictetus is saying, and here's how you do it. You give up all desire for external things, which already sounds pretty wild. And then just switch your aversion from things in the external world to the responses you have that are irrational, such as being upset that someone stood you up at an appointment. So, you know, you got fired. And we're going to come up to more extreme things you shouldn't be upset with in a couple minutes. But I think that the part of what has disappointed me is that there are these great items that are promised to the practitioner of Stoicism. You will be totally free. You will never be disturbed. But then in chapter 2, when he says, okay, give up desire, give up aversion to external things and put them on your internal responses, that there's a feeling that the whole thing has gone kind of flat. because that doesn't sound too promising a result. But I would say that until you understand the larger system of Stoicism, until you read more of Epictetus in the discourses, it starts to make a little more sense. And at this point, because I will bring it up later, I think if you want to understand Epictetus' Enchiridion, the best way to understand it over time is not on its own alone, but the more other Stoicism you read, the picture of this will become a little more plausible and come together more. So that's what I have to say. So Scott, what do you think about chapter 2? Do you find that you're a little ready to brush past it when you're teaching it like me, or do you say there's a lot of good stuff here?
So I think that, and I'm going to also make a little time for Mark. I saw that you had a question, but I'm just going to comment on what you said and then make some time for Mark's question. So I think that 2 is an extension of the grand division in 1, the fundamental divide there from 1, and it's a kind of a set of recipes, saying effectively, look, here's the best way to make sure that you're never disappointed. Don't have your hopes hang on things not up to you, right? Here's a way to make sure that you're never always get things that you like. Make sure that the things that you want are always up to you, right? So that's effectively putting the physics of the grand division as a recipe for pursuing. So you might say an instrumentalization of the grand division. One of the last things, and I think that maybe one of the most interesting things about the end of 2 is the introduction of an interesting new twist on the value theory. And it's this part that I think is, you might say, a place where Epictetus is picking up a longer thread. Because if the value theory really is about this sort of grand division, there's the externals and the things that are up to us, externals and internals. Externals are things that are not of value to us. The things that are up to us are the things of value. A regular question of Stoicism is, how does the Stoic still live? What's the Stoic do? Right? It looks like the Stoic is kind of in shutdown mode. The last kind of sentences of 2 gives us a little begins to give us a little recipe as to how the Stoic takes up with the rest of the world. Here's how Bill and I translate it. But only choose and refuse, and do so gently, with discretion and casually. So that's how Bill and I translated it. But it's that you still take part in the world. You still have preferences. You still have things that are objects that should be objects of indifference. You nevertheless can prefer. But do you do so gently, casually, with discretion? And so the question then is, that's the next kind of puzzle for Stoic ethics, which was, we had this grand division. Externals are things that are things that we should be that we should hold as items of that just of no value. But nevertheless, these are things that we can prefer and choose and discriminate about, but we must do so gently. And so in some ways, it's that sort of that little hanging thread at the end of 2. That's 2 on the one hand is this really excellent recipe for living inside yourself. And then this one little curious sentence at the end, you know what I mean? You're like, how, if I'm living by the grand division, then how exactly, on the basis of what? On the basis of what do I discriminate or choose and refuse, right? That is a sort of a very curious little hanging thread at the end of 2. It looked like the world kind of came in sort of 2 colors, you know what I mean? Right. The internals and the externals. And the externals are things that are objects of indifference. But with objects of indifference, we don't choose, there's no refusing or choosing objects of indifference. We don't care about them. But it looks like we do suddenly. Right. And so I find that very curious. There's a long-standing Stoic tradition that preceded Epictetus about preferred indifference that was supposed to solve this problem. It's clear that Epictetus is relying on that. But ironically enough, Epictetus doesn't give us a lot more about that. I just find that very strange. Again, that's one of the problems with the sort of the short versions of these texts, is that you've got the big idea, you're like, well, if there's a little complication at the end, moving on.
But I think these two elements can coincide, that he does say it's going to be very difficult and extreme, but at the same time, as you proceed in your Stoic practices, your expectations and your movement should be gentle and not, there's nothing you can do that can give you a leap to the sage-like level. So, okay, no, that is a good point too, and I do think the last sentence is really important for that reason, and also the reason you gave, and also the reason of, okay, there's a juxtaposition of two, you could say, attitudes toward it, or two features of it. There's something extreme and something slight in terms of how you proceed. So moving to chapter 3.
May I ask a question?
Mark to get his question in.
Okay.
Mark to get his question in.
Sure.
Well, many questions have come and gone, but I'm wondering, within the time period that we're talking about, within the group of people that we're talking about, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and so on, was society in general Stoic? I mean, it just really seems like these characters, if you'll accept that word, we're off on their own. We're perhaps by themselves and Stoic within their own small group, or I don't really know much about the time period, honestly. So what was it like for Epictetus or Aurelius or whomever else to have this philosophy and live within society as and did they call themselves Stoics? Did they consider them, oh, I'm a Stoic, opposed to any other characteristic they might claim to be their own, and also the things that are up to us and the things that are not up to us. I wish I had a text here in front of me to refer to some of those not up to us things. I think from the point of view of other people other than myself, with perhaps a small amount of Stoicism in my character, would think, well, those things are definitely up to you. Those things are under your control. My ability to make a living or to be solvent, if not well off, but so if society doesn't see those things in a similar way, does that influence anything? By free, does that mean not under others' control? The second, in the second line, I think it is, you're talking about the word free. So I'm free because the way I perceive the world and perceive those things that are up to me and not up to me, I am free because those things that are not, I know what those things are that are not up to me, and what you think of me is not up to me. So I'm free from any control that you might have over me by your words, if not by your actions. Anyway,
Okay, Mark, let's
that's probably a lot to digest, but I did want to make an input on those things.
okay. Scott?
Yeah, I think so. I've got a handful of things to say. So all great questions, Mark. I can answer two of them pretty well. I think that the social context one and then Stoic Freedom one, I think have got pretty good answers. I think the social context one is one that, at least by the time that we get to Epictetus, which is there in sort of the transition at the end of between the 1st and 2nd century, philosophy is pretty well accepted as a sort of a thing. Philosophers get to do their things. In fact, early Christian fathers wrote letters. So, I mean, Christians were sort of famously persecuted in the Roman Empire. One of the strategies that Christians did was analogize themselves to philosophers. Romans had a very high tolerance for philosophers. And they were like, look, we're really just we're just another philosophical school. Think about us as philosophers, and you tolerate the philosophers. In fact, you seem to like them, right? You let them educate your sons and things like that. And so think of us as philosophers. And that was semi-effective for some of these Christian fathers. The second thing about specifically Epictetus, he was initially a slave. He was sold to Emperor Nero's secretary, Epictetus. And he was educated in Rome to be a secretary of the empire, which meant that he needed to learn philosophy. So there was a philosopher by the name of Musonius Rufus, who was a Stoic philosopher, who said, I'm a Stoic, who taught just tons and tons of students there in Rome philosophy. And that meant natural science, political philosophy, argument, rhetoric, all that stuff. And to be a kind of a complete person, right? It's that all the things you need to know to be a complete person. And in that regard, that his program was to then sort of get Epictetus to the point where he could then be a kind of an effective gentleman in the empire, still nevertheless a slave. And he was eventually manumitted. He was released from being a slave, and he became a teacher in Rome too. By the end of his life, philosophers got kicked out of Rome by Domitian, and so he went over into Greece, over in Nicopolis, which is a sort of a city there on the coast, on the sort of the Italian-facing coast of Greece, and set up a school there in Nicopolis, which was kind of like a vacation resort town for Romans. And one of the things that like visiting Romans could do is go see a philosophy lecture, and that was one of the things. So whenever we read Epictetus's discourses, there are really kind of there are two groups of people in the audience for his discourses. You have the folks who were his dedicated students, who were there and were living there in Nicopolis and were learning from him and things like that. And then just Romans were just like, hey, you want to go see some philosophy today? Like, and so he had a famous school there in Nicopolis that folks would just come in and be like, hey, you want to go see the theater? Nah, let's go see some philosophy. And folks would go and see and hear Epictetus's lectures. So that's kind of the status that he had there. And again, he's kind of got a little bit of a larger status because of his student Arian, which is how we get all of Epictetus's stuff. Arian took really good notes. He was a good note taker. And so that's really what the Enchiridion and the discourses are. Or Epictetus did not write this. This was all coming from Epictetus's student Arian, who was a successful general and a successful governor, and he was kind of a Roman big man. And one of the ways to make yourself into a big man, as anyone who's a fan of Alexander the Great knows, is tell the story of yourself being educated by a great philosopher. Alexander the Great was educated by Aristotle. Tell the story of yourself being educated by a great philosopher. So Arian went out of his way to say, hey, there was this great philosopher that I was learning from. His name is Epictetus. Maybe you should read his stuff. And then think that I'm a great man because I studied under this great philosopher. So that's part of the kind of how Epictetus had his status, was that he was kind of a good lecturer. He was kind of an exciting lecturer, and people would go to see him whenever they went on vacation in Nicopolis. And then this great Roman man, Arian, kind of elevated him, and as part of his own elevation to get Epictetus kind of on the map. That's kind of a cool little story. And again, one of the ways that you can get that. Last thing about Stoic freedom is just this thought that it's different from political freedom, right? It's different from political freedom because a Stoic can still be free in a cage, right? A Stoic can still be free in a cage. People can enslave you even, according to the Stoics, and you can still be free. So it's very different from political freedom. And it's in some ways kind of different from, you might say, that free will kind of notion of freedom, that in fact, the Stoics didn't think that there was such a thing as that kind of free will freedom. There's no capacity to do otherwise. So what exactly is it? And it's just that You are in control of how you react to the world. The world
Got it.
doesn't tell you how to react. You're in control of you.
All right, Scott, we are on number 3. Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
Okay, so 3 is the exercise of the jugs. And it's kind of got two or the mugs. We translated it as mugs, but better jugs. But here it is in a nutshell. You've maybe had a nice mug or like a nice teacup or something like that. And you've said, and Epictetus says, hey, if you got a favorite mug, say to yourself, hey, I love a mug. I love a jug. Because you remind yourself that it's a finite and breakable thing so that you are preparing yourself for when it breaks. You remind yourself that you're loving something that's finite and fragile. And then you're supposed to move, that you start with sort of the trivial things, mugs, fragile porcelain mice, those sorts of things. And then you move to things that are more important to you. And so he says, whenever you're kissing your child, or whenever you're kissing your spouse, remind yourself that you're kissing a mortal, so that when they die or when they leave, it won't destroy you. And the important thing again is to see this in light of what I had said about one, which was what you're doing is you're not directly controlling your beliefs about this. You're not directly controlling how you're responding to the breaking of your mug or to the death of a spouse. What you're doing is you are in control over whether or not you do the exercises that prepare you and prepare your mind. So there's one set of exercises for Stoics. There are these exercises of preparation for a challenge. And then there's another set of exercises for enduring a challenge. And so exercises of preparation in some ways steel you for something and properly orient your mind towards these things so that you're not surprised. And so that you're not shaken by them. The challenge, of course, is what I call and what Bill and I call in the book the ruin challenge of it, which is simply the following: does reminding yourself of the mortality of your spouse or child ruin that relationship? Does reminding yourself of the fact that whenever your mug is breakable undercut that connection with the mug? Now, the important thing to remember is that Epictetus allows you, right? This is the amazing thing, right? This was the hold on gently thing at the end of 2. Hold on gently. You're still allowed to hold on. You're allowed to have a favorite mug. You're allowed to feel affection for your spouse. You're allowed to have a child and kiss them. The Stoic is not someone who's totally standoffish and doesn't have favorite mugs. The Stoic isn't somebody who doesn't kiss their children. Stoics kiss their children. Stoics love their spouses. Stoics have favorite mugs. That seems amazing. That seems contrary to the way we think of Stoics as sort of standoffish and impervious to things. The way that Stoics become invincible to these things is by reminding themselves of the fact that all is fleeting. And one of the again, remember this ruin challenge. The ruin challenge is reminding yourself that someday it'll all end, that this is a breakable mug, that this is a human being that will sometimes die, that may die and will die. The question is whether or not that actually destroys the relationship and the appreciation. And the answer is it doesn't. Anyone who's ever loved knows that knowing that it is a finite love makes it poignant. Anyone who's ever appreciated, everyone who's ever appreciated a mug knows that whenever you know that someday that mug will break, doesn't make it so that you're like, well, then fuck this mug, right? You're like, no, you hold the mug and you're like, I'm now capable of savoring my time with these things. What Stoicism does is that it makes you, on the one hand, invulnerable, but it also makes you capable of appreciating all these small things. Because it seems like it almost takes like one of these sort of weird magic tricks to make people who think that things are permanent and people who live under this illusion of permanence to be able to appreciate and savor things. I mean, it takes a wedding or a graduation ceremony or a funeral for people to be like, oh, I'm reminded that things are fleeting and right, life goes on and things like that, and then they have like a little tear in their eye. The Stoic, because of what they do, because of the exercises that they do, are on the one hand preparing themselves for the losses so that they're not destroyed by them, but are also doing their best to appreciate those small things in their lives. with open eyes, not under the illusion that they'll last forever, but with the knowledge that these things are finite and fleeting.
Well, I think you hit upon some of the important parts there in terms of the issue of no surprise. Because if you look at Marcus Aurelius and Seneca and Epictetus at different points, they will say it's actually foolish to be surprised with things that are part of life that happen to everyone. And the way that I read this chapter is that he's not simply telling you to say this to yourself, but to ask really, what is the nature of each thing? And so, okay, this is a coffee mug, and it might sound like a trivial thing, but if you see the way people respond to breakable things breaking, it seems like most people have not internalized what the real nature of it is, that this thing's made of porcelain, it has a very wide opening, so it's more likely to spill than a sippy cup or something like that. And I actually, in this book, and I will include the next chapter when I get to it, what is its nature is a great question to ask of everything. And Epictetus doesn't say this, but I think the Stoic view is ask the nature of each thing that you're involved in. Say a relationship. So quite briefly, a romantic relationship, it takes two people to agree to start it, but only one to end it. And maybe you want something stronger, but that's called marriage. Then you're getting the state and lawyers involved. But if you really understand the nature of what a relationship is, that a unilateral ending can take place on either side of the relationship, then you shouldn't be totally surprised if you get that dreaded ghosting that is so popular in 2022. Now, just a couple quick points about chapter 3 that are notable. Like Scott says, there's no transition of gradual buildup between the breaking of a mug and the death of your spouse. And this from other things we know about Epictetus, this seems to be his lecturing style, to allow you to have that shock, because he could have gone from your mug to your guitar to your car, and then you might have seen, okay, I get it now, maybe that's how I should see my spouse, but he just lays it on you in a sharp and blunt way. The second thing to note here is that there is a lot of online discussion. Maybe there is a Facebook Stoicism, but many people say today, because of certain discussions that have been had, I don't understand where people got the idea that Stoics say you should get rid of all emotions, but when you talk about someone not being upset by a spouse dying, that should be exhibit A as to why people think that, right? Whether that's exactly accurate or not is another matter. But I just thought I'd add those points. Anything else on chapter 3, Scott?
Yeah, I'll note one last thing, which is maybe the last point, which is that that Stoic theory of emotions really kind of divides things into really sort of two classes. You've got, on the one hand, patheia, and then on the other hand, you have passions. And you can have good feelings. So again, the Stoics allow you to have good feelings about your mugs and things like that, and your spouse. But there are passions that are certain kinds of status of emotions that sort of take away your self-control. And it's in those that the Stoics are trying to avoid. I think the Stoics will allow you to be like, yeah, you can feel pain. You can even feel bad about stuff. There's a difference between feeling bad about something and being disturbed by something, being upsettled by that. And so I think that I think that a distinction along those lines is useful there, to say that Stoicism is supposed to not rob you of, you might say, the sort of the small scale things. It's supposed to make it so that you are immune to the really big ones. Looks like Nancy's got a question.
Yes, Nancy.
Yeah, I was just wondering, Scott, when you were talking about the loss of something and that it's the exercise of preparing versus enduring, I found that really interesting because when I would think about the loss of something that's particularly close to me, it seemed like I was trying to figure out how am I going to endure it rather than preparing for it. It kind of automatically goes to a selfish way of thinking, right? How is this going to impact on me? How am I going to get over the loss? Is there something that deals with this in Epictetus that I'm fairly new to Stoicism, so I was just wondering, is there? I really like the way you said it because now I will think about it differently when I think of a loss. But is there something about how to endure a loss?
Yeah, that's a great one. And I think that there are. So we even take, for example, sort of the simple fact that like losses that surprise us affect us differently. Like we, you know, whenever we have a family member who has been in a sort of a long decline, we in some ways have already kind of done the work of preparing for their departing. Whereas surprise cases are ones which like they affect us differently, partly because of the fact that we haven't done that preparatory work. But your question is less about the preparatory work. You're like, okay, got that. It's about the enduring. And I think that the enduring, on the one hand, with Epictetus, is one where, on the one hand, he's got these sort of like, you have kinds of exercises that make it so that you are prepared, not cognitively, but you might say you have habits that make it so that you can endure them. Simple examples were that Stoics would deprive them of these sort of acts of negation, where you'd say abnegation, where you deprive yourself of water. You're like, okay, look, I'm thirsty, but you know what, I'm going to go without. You know, or like I'm angry, I'm going to delay. I'm not going to act on it, right? And so these strategies of enduring are ones where you say, look, there are ways for me to be able to see that I can survive this, right? Or I can survive versions of this. And then you say, okay, I can survive versions of this. I can survive this, right? And so part of Stoic training is, again, this sort of, it's not that you have perfect control in the moment. It's to be able to develop certain kinds of skills so that whenever the moments come, you kind of have got like a kind of a muscle memory to it. You know what I mean? I again have all sorts of skepticism. I mean, I'm not really a Stoic. I'm Stoish. Does that make any sense? So I think that there are sort of limits as to how the endurance point can actually be taken. I think that, you know, and this is the reason why, for as much as I admire Epictetus, it's really Seneca that I think has sort of got the sort of the soft Stoicism program, where Seneca's like, look, you know, there are Stoic exercises that can prepare you for the loss of your child, but grief is a natural emotion. You should feel grief. What Stoicism is really committed to doing is mitigating the suffering that comes along with that grief, and mitigating how long you feel it, not making you immune to it. And so in this regard, thinking of Stoicism as a kind of a management of the passions instead of eliminating the passions program. Again, that's Seneca and not Epictetus. Epictetus has got the more ambitious program. But I myself, I'm generally a skeptically minded person, and so I'm generally like, but there's a great promise to it. And you know, I'm inclined to think that the Senecan program is the more plausible, because it does look like Seneca's right to me, where it's like, look, you know, it does look wrong to me. There's like, I'm just not upset at all. Like you know, you have these stories about like, what's his name? I can't remember the guy's name. It's Stilpo of Megara, where his town is burned. Seneca tells the story. His town is burned down, and he's lost his family. And the general that burned his town sees Stilpo, a practicing Stoic, walking out of town. Everyone else is weeping and crying and things like that. It's like, yeah, getting in their faces, what an asshole this guy is. And Stilpo's walking out of town. It's like totally unfazed. And the general says, I took everything from you today. And Stilpo says, you didn't take anything from me today. Like, and Seneca's like, that's victory, but that's impossible for us. Like, that's just that's a crazy story. And so maybe one way to even kind of think about this is as a kind of a striving program, thinking about it saying like, look, there's no way I could reach something like that. But in some ways, that's a kind of a weird kind of distant point for me. What I'd like to be able to do is be able to sort of be appropriately upset as a human being in the face of this, but not be destroyed by it. And I think that's part of the program. What do you think about that, Nancy?
That sounds good. So you're saying that Seneca may have some things there that will help me understand better. And to me, it's looking for things that kind of maybe help you through the stages of grief, right?
Right. That's a great observation. I'll say one extra last thing about this, which is part of Stoicism isn't just helping you manage the bad stuff. It's also helping you manage the good stuff.
Yeah.
To manage the good stuff, to manage the bad stuff, you have to be able to manage the good stuff, and you can't be changed by the good stuff. And so, one of the bad things that often happens to us is that fortune is good to us.
Yeah, and fortune doesn't always last. So there is an end to that as well.
That's why it's bad for us. Right.
To understand that, right? Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
And let me just add one point to Scott's points, and that is the topic of virtue, which Epictetus really doesn't get into in this work, is central to Stoicism. And the Stoics believe that virtue is a craft or a skill. So these skills we're talking about, what you're doing is you're moving toward virtue by undertaking these practices. Okay, so let's talk about chapter 4. And this is I said one chapter I was disappointed in. This is one I'm never disappointed in. And it involves a question I said is present in 3 and expressly in some translations. What is its nature? And Epictetus does say, what is the nature of my action? I think what he's really asking here is, what is the nature of the situation I'm entering? And so what you should do is you should find out, okay, what situation am I entering now? Am I going to a business meeting? Am I going to a party? And he talks about going to take a bath in a public bath. And this goes back to, this will cover a number of issues we've already discussed, but one of them is no surprises, because in a bath, the bathhouse that he's describing in ancient Rome, he says there will be people splashing, teasing, jostling. And one thing to note was that besides being a slave, Epictetus was crippled, reportedly when he was a slave, by his master. That's one story. And so he's saying you might have something stolen. People will bump into you. And so there's some jerks at the pool. But that's not why he went to the pool. He went to the pool to take a bath, to enjoy bathing and to get clean. And here's what he says that I think is quite interesting. He says that in a sense, you should prepare yourself for the nature of the situation, but always keep, and this is my way of putting it, always keep your larger goal in life to be in harmony with nature, or to be in accordance with nature, which, if you put that briefly, means reason. And then you will be able to deal with such a situation well. And so the way I like to describe it is that Epictetus tells us, he says, in a sense, give yourself dual objectives. You're going to the grocery store, but you might get into a dispute over who gets the last pear, right? There might be somebody that is in the 12 items and under line, but they have 14 or 15 things, 15 boxes of pretzels. And that might usually upset you. So when you go into a situation, find out what is its nature, and have this, as I describe it, a dual objective. I'm going to stay in harmony with nature and to be unperturbed by whatever happens. But yes, I am going into a bathhouse. I'm going to go bathing. And so if it turns out that I am jostled, if someone steals my towel, if somebody pushes me around, well, I can keep myself in harmony with nature because I had this larger objective as well, which is not to be perturbed by by the incidentals of life, to see that it's not important. This person didn't harm me by stealing my towel, that's an external, and so forth. And so I think this can be applied to any number of things in life. And just as an example, there's one area of life, one arena in which most fistfights happen. And what do you think that is? Answer: bars. So a lot of people like to go into a dive, but if fisticuffs should unfold at some point in the night because people are drunk, you just say, okay, that's the kind of thing that happens in this kind of place. And so you don't be foolish and say, how did I ever get mixed up in this? So that's my introduction to chapter 4. What do you think, Scott?
So I think that, and I see 4 is also another one of these exercises of anticipation, exercises of preparation. And the part of the objective is, as you said, I think rightly, David, which is reminding yourself what the goal is. And a great irony is that we don't always, is that we recognize it in retrospect, and it's doing it in prospect. And so and even a better irony about this is that people who claim to be Stoics are particularly bad about this. Why? Because they get angry about Stoicism.
Yes.
Right. You all laugh because you've been on that page, or you went to that lecture or something like that. And again, partly because of the fact that they're invested and they think they see themselves as part of this. But one of the challenges is that, especially if you're going to be committed to an intellectual tradition or an intellectual program, you're doing philosophy, disagreement's going to be all over the place. People are going to have interesting things to say, and sometimes not so interesting things to say, or dumb things to say. And you know what you need to do? Just like you did to the baths, right? But it turns out that not everybody does that, even with Stoicism. And so it's an insane thing. But what does it show? It shows that we're not sages. It shows that we still have got progress to make. And there's one last worry that I myself have got about this particular exercise of anticipation. And it's the following: that instead of, you might say, preparing myself and reminding myself of my better goal, my concern, at least with myself, is that I'm pre-angering myself.
You're pre-angering?
I'm like, I go in and I'm like, you know what? My father-in-law is going to say that thing one more time again. It's like, or my neighbor's dog is going to bark tonight, and it's going to be at 3 a.m. And then instead of boiling down, you know what I mean? It's like pre-boiling, you know what I mean? And so I wonder, I do have this concern, and again, this is just a kind of an empirical question, and maybe it's a question about people's temperaments, whether or not certain exercises of anticipation can under the wrong conditions, used in the wrong way, can actually pre-anger you and actually make things worse. Because I know for sure that I've done this going into intellectual exchanges and things like that, and said, okay, well, I'm going to kind of do the exercise of the baths, and that guy's going to say the stupid fucking thing that guy always says, and I'm going to be, and then I'm like, okay, am I like this or am I like this, right? And sometimes it's this and sometimes it's that. And the problem is that it's not that not all of these are sort of foolproof strategies.
Right.
Not all of these are ones that sort of work every time strategies. And I think that one of the lessons of the Stoic exercises is that it's more like a toolbox, and you have to know something about yourself. You have to know you, and you have to say, like, look, sometimes I try on these exercises and they don't work every time. So this is a screwdriver that I'm just not the right screw for, right? There are other tools that are better for me, but I'll admit, this is one, like, I love this exercise. It's a great, cool exercise, and it's really revealing, but I'm really skeptical as to whether or not it's actually effective as an exercise of anticipation. I think that for me, more often than not, it pre-angers me.
Well, okay, look, one thing to add to this, and you did raise the fact that many people that are self-described Stoics can flip out about Stoicism, which should make you question a lot of what you've been doing. But I think Epictetus' little last sentence in 2 of move carefully and gently, and later he says, if your foot was hurt, you would tread lightly. Those kinds of warnings, those may not be heeded as much as they can be, because many people can start to think, I'm making progress, man. And then that could be the thing that really messes them up when they go for a bath. Okay, so.
Yeah, I'll say one last thing about this, which is, this is the reason why I think Seneca's program, this modest or this sort of easy Stoicism model is more practicable, because Seneca's like, look, I can't make you invulnerable. So on the one hand, Seneca says, like, look, you got somebody who makes you angry, but you have to talk to him. Make sure you do so, like, make sure you eat something before you talk to him. Make sure you have some water, take a nap, right? Like, if you're tired, like, they're going to make you more angry. So take a nap before, like, try to rest before meeting them. And then he says, look, if you can, just avoid them. Like, that's the best, right? And so again, this more modest, sort of soft Stoicism program that we see with Seneca is one that's, again, Epictetus is the aspirationalist. Epictetus is the hard Stoic. Seneca's on anger is just kind of like, look, I can give you some techniques that work, but they don't work for everybody. Sometimes if you're not a perfectly wise person and you're not perfectly placid, sometimes you just shouldn't be hangry whenever you're going to hang around people. Like, Stoic exercises just don't work if you're hangry.
Right. No, good point. Okay, so Mark had a question.
Well, I'm just reflecting on what Scott has been saying, and it's practice. If I could be Stoic in an instant, maybe that would be great. I don't know, because it's impossible. But it's practice, and we all stumble, and maybe I don't care for that generalization about we all do something, but but I stumble and I get triggered, and those are moments when, if I am aware enough, if my mind works fast enough, I can catch myself and say, oh, you're going to get pissed off, or you are pissed off. Think about that. What's going on that makes that happen? And and look at it and examine it and reframe it if you can. I have a hard time with reframing things, but they are helpful. On a personal note, I reframed how I thought about how my father thought about me, because of something my eldest cousin told me about my great-grandfather and how he disciplined his child and his child disciplined my father, and so on, that made it really easier for me to feel better about myself by simply reframing that. It also occurs to me that what you're all talking about is that Stoicism was mindfulness before mindfulness ever became a word. which is really really great. I mean, a friend of mine, Charlie Brott, has said for many years, don't believe everything. Yeah, don't believe everything you think. and you know, one of these ancient Stoics probably could have said the same thing. So I just wanted to throw those things in there, and I really appreciate what you and Scott are bringing to us to think about and discuss. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for saying that. One thing to add that I think might give a different dimension to what we're talking about is that so far we've been talking about disciplines of your the things you do to discipline your mind to be in a certain way. But I think one aspect of Stoicism that is important to take into account is you're actually seeing the world differently over time. In other words, you start a practice of seeing what's in my power, what's not in my power. And then you consistently use that frame for different things. And then you do that with humans and say, okay, I'm a human, I am finite, my life is finite. But over time, one part of what keeps you from being perturbed is you actually have a different perspective on the things you face in general in life. So it's not all a direct training of your emotions. Some part of it is you're shaping your soul through different perspectives you have on different things in life to see things differently. Because if you go into a situation and you're used to seeing, okay, so this is under my control, this is not, and one we're going to get to later, which is people respond based on how things appear to them. If that becomes familiar to you, then that's part of what makes you less perturbed. So I just wanted to throw in that dimension of the practice. You're not always directly working on your emotions. Some part of it is how you're seeing different parts of the world changes. So Scott, do you have anything to add to that? Okay.
In fact, that's a great place to just segue to 5.
Okay, great.
Because 5 opens with the observation that what disturbs people is not things. What disturbs people is their judgment of things. And so Epictetus's example, and so I will start by just saying this is a form of what is called cognitivism about emotions, that it's in your judgments that you get the negative reactions. It's because of the fact that you think a bad thing has happened to you that then you then react and have the reaction, you might say the effective reactions that you got. Your body responds given the fact that you've judged something a certain way. So your body can respond to being struck. Your body will respond to that. It'll be painful. You may squirm around a bit. But thinking that a bad thing has happened to you, you will then have extra responses. It's, you might say, the extra bad problem, right? It's in the judgment that you get the extra bad. And in this case, Epictetus's example is Socrates on death. He doesn't give a Socrates' argument, which is interesting. So Socrates, you guys know who Socrates is. He had to drink some hemlock. He annoyed some Athenians before he did so. But Socrates, when after at the end of his trial, addresses the jurors that voted for him to have to die, and he says, "Look, you think that you're doing some bad thing to me if this is a punishment, but you don't know if death is a bad thing. I don't know if a death is a bad thing, and I can only be afraid of it if I think it's a bad thing. So death is either a relocation to a place where I'm with the famous dead, it's like it's go to Hades, or it's like a dreamless sleep. Dreamless sleeps aren't bad, right? That's fine. And a relocation to Hades isn't so bad because then I get to talk to the great dead. I get to go and talk to Odysseus, and I don't just get to bother the Athenians. I get to bother all the dead. It'd be awesome. That would be really wonderful if I could hang around with all the heroes. And so you think that you're doing me some terrible bad thing by killing me. But in fact, I've got reason to think it might be good, or at the very least reason to think it might not be so bad. So you don't know it's bad. And as a consequence of this, it looked like Socrates was able to be in control of his emotions. Again, didn't keep him from being killed, didn't keep him from even feeling the pain of death as it came upon him. That invulnerability doesn't follow from Stoic invulnerability. What Stoic invulnerability does is it takes the extra bad of the judgment that a bad has happened to you all. The end of 5 is the part that actually touches on something that Mark had mentioned earlier, which is that the end of 5 is the place where we've really got folks, we've really kind of got 3 classes of folks. We've got what Epictetus calls the uneducated, those working on their education, and then the fully educated. And the uneducated are people who just get buffeted by their judgments, and they make terrible judgments. They think that someone whispering something bad about them is a terrible, awful thing. You have the people who are working on their education, progressors, who are working on their invulnerability. They still make mistakes, but they still have to, but they at the very least are pointed in the right direction. And then you've got the fully educated, those who are in complete control of their judgments and don't make errors in their judgment. And really who Epictetus is addressing in the Enchiridion is that middle class of folks, that progressors, the folks working on their education. The uneducated, he can't reach, or at the very least, they're not interested in hearing. The fully educated don't need to hear. It's those working on their education, those who are saying, look, I see that I make errors. I see that I want to reduce this kind of suffering. I can't reduce the suffering of my body whenever things, or I can't reduce me feeling bad whenever and missing my cup. But at the very least, I can be in control of my passions whenever my cup breaks. I'd like to make it so that every time I go to the baths, I'm not furious whenever I come home. I just want to come home. I just want to go to the baths, right? It's folks who are working on that he's addressing. And those 3 classes are really important 3 classes. And in fact, this is a point in Epictetus's Enchiridion where Epictetus is actually breaking from a long-standing Stoic tradition of saying there are really only 2 classes of people. The uneducated and the wise, and there's never the twain shall meet. That's a long-standing Stoic division. And Epictetus has introduced here in 5 a new concept and a new category, those who are working on themselves. And I think that that's a really important contribution to the Stoic tradition, is what we see here at the end of 5. The class of folks who are wanting to be wise and kind of have got a pretty good picture of what it is, but know that they've still got a long way to go, versus the folks who are just not interested.
Well, Scott, that's great that you caught that. I never thought of it that way, but that does change the story of there are only the wise and then the rest of us are flat out fools, which is the way of the old Stoics. One thing I would like to add to what you said is that, well, first of all, I would say this single sentence might be the most important sentence to modern psychology, period, because Albert Ellis, the father of rational emotive behavioral therapy, said this sentence, it is not things that upset us, but our judgments of them. This was the origin of his school of psychology, and then cognitive behavioral therapy, which followed it in time, but is similar in this respect. The founder of it said that the Stoics came up with the basic idea. Just one point, because we've talked a lot about techniques and how to progress. There are several techniques that the Stoics give us for dealing with our judgments of things so as not to get upset. For one example, one is to substitute one thought for another. Don't say, I have lost it. Epictetus says this. Say, I have given it back to nature, right? And that could be a child, a spouse, a pet, a friend. And Marcus Aurelius does something else, which is also a way to have no judgment that upsets you, which is either have a purely descriptive judgment of the thing, or have no judgment at all, but just delay. In other words, if something you ordinarily say is bad happens, just don't make a judgment at all. If somebody cuts you off, just watch it happen and don't make a judgment. And lastly, Epictetus himself in this text says at several points, I believe 2, delay. Just delay making that judgment and don't worry about what judgment you make. That could buy you time to not introduce upset into your life. So, I just want to go back to you, Scott. That's great that you brought that up, because I don't think anybody has pointed that out. So in terms of time, I think we're going to go to general questions in 1 minute. So Mark, your hand has been heated, but I just want to say this about chapter 10. This chapter seemed really trivial to me for years, because you have the resources to deal with things. If something happens that that you don't like, you have endurance to deal with it. You have patience for something that's going on a long time, etc. But there is something deep and important about this chapter, and I'll just give you one reason. The Stoic view, which you can see in Epictetus's discourses, is that you have virtue in you in some form, in seed form. So what he's saying is, you have courage in you, you have prudence in you. All that you need do, and that's what all these exercises and practices are about, is bringing it to full bloom inside of you. It's not, virtue isn't a mysterious thing that's outside of you or something that society constructs at one time in history or another. You have the virtues within you. And I'll just give you 2 quick examples. One, emergency situations. Your house is on fire and your children are in it. You can see that you will have courage in that situation. And then the second example I would give quickly is, in your childhood, you do things that take guts, even if they're not the things that your parents are happy with, or later you say, that was a dumb thing to do. But I think there's something pretty important in what Epictetus says, that it's not just a capacity you have, it's that you have virtue in a incomplete form inside you. And then the Stoic life is meant to bring that out. So I know we have 2 chapters to go, but I think it's time to get to some general questions and then we'll wrap it up. So Mark, you raise your hand. What question do you have?
So on the sentence that I have given it back to nature, if I lose an item, if I don't know where it is, call that lost. If I don't consciously lose it, if I don't throw it out the window as I'm driving down the road, why is it personalized? Why personalize that thought rather than thinking or saying it went back to nature? If my wife dies, I don't give her back to nature. She went back to nature. Mm-hmm. You see what I'm saying? Is it any idea as to why it was personalized in that way?
Well, the first thing I would say in answer to that is that some things about Stoic writings give us a sample of, I think, many of the things they would have said. So, and I think Epictetus would actually encourage you, if you had a better reframing of the situation, better self-talk, to use that if you think that is going to reduce your chance of being disturbed. So I don't think this is one of those things in the Stoic text that we should take as, oh, you should always do it this way. We just don't have enough information to know. because most of the original Stoic writings were lost. So, but you do make a good point, but I think he's doing that because he's imagining someone who would think, I lost it. So he's starting with the person who's thinking that way, and then saying, based on the way that you think, then it would be apt to say, I have given it back. But if you don't think of it that way, then maybe what you suggested might work. What do you think, Scott?
So, Mark, I really like the way that you framed the challenge, which is there's a difference between losing your keys and giving your keys away. Right? Throwing your keys behind. Like, I lost my keys behind the couch. I didn't put them behind the couch, right? So like returning a library book and losing my books are different things, right? And so this is the place where, when we first started our conversation, I had mentioned this sort of Stoic minimalists and Stoic sort of systematists, it's like, can you do Stoic ethics and all of these exercises without being committed to sort of the whole Stoic system? And they've got gods and things like that in it. And I think that the I returned it view is one that does depend on a kind of view about a kind of providential role that you might say, even so in the part that David has made reference to whenever I gave it back and returned it to nature, it's in Enchiridion 11. But at the very end, he makes an analogy where it's like, look, treat everything kind of like you would like the furniture in a hotel that you visit. Where it's like, is it your chair? Like, it's the chair you're sitting in, right? Mm-hmm. It's not your chair. So whenever you leave, like, you're just like, my chair, see, maybe I'll stay here again, right? And I think that, but whose chair is it? Well, it's the hotel owners. Whose person is it that was returned? Look, you just borrowed your wife for a while. It's Zeus's. That's Zeus's person, right? All of these things are Zeus's things. Zeus let you borrow this person for a while. You are returning it to Zeus. And I think that, and again, some of these strategies work, and some of these sort of little plays with your mind work only if you think that the world has got like gods and providence and things like that in it. If you don't think that there's gods and providence, thinking that you returned something to nature, you're like, well, not really. Was it really nature's? I mean, she's made of nature, but it's like, you belong to nature. Nature doesn't own things, right? But if you've got that kind of more theologically robust conception of like the gods being identical to nature, then nature does own those things and you do return them. But that's the more controversial and weird views, you know what I mean? So you can see why the debates between the Stoic minimalists, where it's like, look, I think we can do Stoicism without the gods. And then you get problems with these passages, right? Where they're like, nature doesn't own stuff, so I can't return it, right? Whereas the other one's like, yeah, nature owns stuff. Nature's intentional. Nature's providential. Nature's like Zeus, and you're like, yeah, I can totally make sense of that. It's just if nature were like that, but now you've got a sort of a bigger fish to fry with a kind of an intentional notion of nature. Is that an okay answer?
Yeah. Yes. And I'll go on to say that it's within nature. It's within the nature of all things to do what they do. It's within nature for me to lose my keys. It's within the nature of being alive that my wife will die and that I will die. And every now and then I find something that I like, a passage from the Enchiridion or just about anywhere else that it's not too awfully long and complicated that I'll copy and paste and throw up on Facebook just because I want to see it and perhaps get some reactions that will help me further understand it or understand it from someone else's perspective. And I did that with this particular passage, and a friend of mine was very angry with me for doing so, which shows where he is in his life and mind. And he has had 4 wives, and 3 of them have died, which is, beyond my scope of experience. but he was very angry with me for putting that up there. He says, I didn't return them. I didn't return my wife's. And, you know, so anyway, I found that quite interesting, and it's something I need to read over and over again. I found that with the first few pages of Enchiridion that, boy, I had to read those first lines, those first chapters. I've spent days with them just reading that first chapter. I go to a diner for lunch many days, since especially anyway, I always take a book with me. And when I bought the Enchiridion, I think I spent a week rereading that first passage, and just while I was eating my lunch, and
That sounds like the right
trying to
approach.
incorporate it, and that's kind of been my discipline for a while. And so, yeah, thank you.
And that sounds like what I don't know how many times I've read it, but probably more than that. And Scott has probably read it more times than me. One thing to note though about the Enchiridion is that what Scott just mentioned about providence and Zeus, God, and so on. It's not clear that Epictetus is talking about that in this book, because in his other book, of which this is a bunch of excerpts, the discourses, he does get more explicitly into his views about what Zeus is like. Whereas here he talks about gods when he talks about what's the practice of predicting the future, prognostication, and he talks about the person who assigns the roles in life, but you're not sure what he's talking about. But it's good that we brought it up, because that does give some context to ownership. And it's probably good that you didn't tell your friend about that part, that Zeus is owning the wives, the furniture, because that does sound a very
I'm not wise enough to really respond to my friend other than with compassion.
right.
I certainly, I didn't try to explain or argue or anything other than to say that my heart goes out to you for your loss.
Right.
That it would have been of no benefit to me and not to him for me to say anything other than that, in my philosophy.
Yeah, so Mark, I want to applaud you for that bit of judgment. And Epictetus too also seems to recognize that there are right and wrong times to talk Stoic philosophy with folks. And so even in the Enchiridion, he has the example of his friend mourning the loss of a child. He says, cry along with him, don't cry inside, right? But he doesn't say, hey, rehearse the grand division with your friend who lost a child. Like, that is the wrong time. It's the wrong time to do that. And I, as a teacher, have had lots of cases where folks in the midst of loss read the Enchiridion and are just like, what is this? Don't tell me how to feel. Don't tell me how to grieve. Don't tell me how to feel about this. I didn't give my brother away. I didn't give my parents away. They're still, and in some ways, the Stoic just has to say, in these cases, we have to mourn with you. In these cases, that our role, our duty to you is not to tell you about Stoicism. Our duty to you is to help you mitigate the suffering. And if that means to cry with you, to cry with you. And so I think that, and that's a Stoic view. You don't have to be going full Stoic all the time. You got to be a human too. And being a human with other humans sometimes means you have to be a shoulder they cry on and to cry along with them.
And I would just add to that Epictetus is not the best one on that kind of point. Marcus Aurelius definitely shows more of a humane approach to interpersonal relationships. And I just should mention that part of the book in chapter 3 that Scott discussed, where he says, just say I'm kissing a human goodnight, so when they die, you won't be upset. I would say that that is the chapter at which I can tell that I've lost most students who won't agree with the rest of the book because of that, because they just think that's inhuman. So do we have any other questions? Yes.
Well, I'd be curious to know where Alex and Bruno and Nancy are and what brought them to this group today. I'm currently in South Carolina myself. My home is 1,000 miles north of here, or where I call home is 1,000 miles north of here, where my wife is, in the very northernmost parts of New York State, up within 2 hours drive of Ottawa, Ontario, and 4 hours drive from Albany, New York. And I'm currently in South Carolina, where my beehives are located. They stay here for the winter. And I get to enjoy 2 springs and I miss mud season, which I don't miss it. I'm not there when it happens in northern New York. So that's where I am, and that's what I'm doing. I'd be curious to know a little bit about what other people are doing, if they would care to share, and if we have time for that sort of thing, David.
Sure. Alex, Bruno, Nancy, would you like to share what brought you here, where you are, and
Sure. I know we're not finished with the exercise, right? We're still doing chapter 30 and 42. But anyway, I will share my story. I'm in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada. We just had a snowstorm. So yeah, plenty of lovely snow. I normally winter in Palm Springs, but because of this pandemic and my husband's very high risk, we've decided to spend the last couple of winters here at home, just to be on the safe side, and because we have our support system here more so. But anyway, I became interested in Stoicism when I borrowed a book from the library called A Manual for Living, an Epictetus, a new interpretation by Sharon LaBelle. It's just a tiny little book. And a lot of it really spoke to me. And I thought, wow, this is what I'm looking for. This is how I want to control more of how I'm living, how I'm viewing the world and others and myself. So since then, I've been gathering all sorts of books by Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and Seneca, primarily, Musonius Rufus as well. My main problem right now is, where do I start and which ones do I read first? And finding the time to do it all. But anyway, I'm working on that slowly but surely, and really enjoying it. I certainly, like Mark and many others, have to think through some of it as to whether it applies to me. But I also believe that I'm not going to necessarily accept everything as it is. I'm going to accept what I believe, what rings true for me, and what I feel makes me a better person. So I'm still open to other philosophies and practices.
I'm for that too.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, you're following in Cicero's footsteps then, Nancy. He was a great eclectic, and he just said, look, I don't judge the schools on their terms, I judge the schools on my terms.
Yeah.
You have good company in that.
Well, that's good. I'll have to read Cicero.
Another book
you.
on the pile, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So Bruno or Alex?
Sure. Well, I'm a reforming control freak, so I've found that this dabbling in this philosophy has been good for me in some ways, because at the start of the pandemic, everything just kind of fell apart, and everything got out of my control very quickly when I had everything sort of in neat little spaces and boxes. So it was sort of adapt or start to spiral down the drain. And, you know, I just sort of out there dabbling, and, you know, picked up meditations, and I think I picked up a book. I think it's Ferriolo, or Ferriolo is the last name. He's a professor. Gosh, I can't remember the name of the book. It's like Meditations on Failure and Self-Discipline, I think is the name of the book. But yeah, it just got me thinking, and I took some of those strategies to kind of change how I was reacting to events, instead of trying to pull everything back together the way it was, to kind of take a new approach, and it served me very well. So hence,
Right.
I'm here. And I haven't even read any Epictetus, but I'll get to that.
All right, fantastic. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
Bruno,
I'm fairly new to Stoicism. I'm currently in northern New Mexico, about 100 miles from Albuquerque. I graduated from university at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon, but that was in '87. So first year philosophy was a while ago now. I have because I am a member of a Roman Catholic religious order, I have a heavy interest in some of the early monastic writings, such as the Desert Fathers and the writings in the Philokalia. I think that's how it's supposed to be pronounced. And I'm finding a lot of parallels with what some of the Stoic writers were talking about, with some of the Desert Fathers and some of the Neptic Fathers. So I'm really just here to learn. That's all. I'm nobody special.
okay. Well, thank you for coming, and thank you, Nancy, and thank you, Alex, and thank you, Mark. So I think that'll be a wrap for today. And next week we're going to be ready to do deep cuts, and we'll do 30 and 42 then, because Nancy wants to hear what we're going to have to say, Scott. Okay. So thank you all for coming, and I will be in touch with the link, and I hope you join us next week. And that's our wrap.
Nice to meet everybody.
Okay.